Yeah, thank you all for being here and opening your hearts to this.
So I'm glad that you brought up in your introduction about self-deception. And as we saw with the act of killing last night, there's distinct links between the musical productions in that film and then the musical productions in this film. So what was I guess that the concept of self-deception, music as self-deception, where does that come from for you?
Well, yeah, first I think there really is a deep connection, not just between the musical numbers here and the musical numbers, because there are two of them in the act of killing, but the reenactments in general in the act of killing. They what's sort of prompting Anwar Congo in the act of killing, I think, to propose ever more elaborate, wild, surreal dramatizations is a fear that how he wants to be seen by my camera, how he wants the world to see him, is not really how he sees himself. And I think in that same sense, as we wrote the script for the end, I found that where the songs belonged were in these crises of doubt, moments when the character's bubble was being pricked by not necessarily even the arrival of girl, which does cause a catastrophe for the family, even as it offers them the real possibility for hope and happiness and change if they were able to accept the gift of honesty that she brings. But even before that, whenever truth intrudes, the fact that Son is too old to play with figurines, or that Friend seems to be suspicious of Friend when she sings her lullaby, prompting her to sing her lullaby. So the truth, what was sort of a principle writing the film, and then I'll come directly to your question, was that what gets this movie singing is not sort of the cliche about Golden Age musicals, that the truth is too big for speech and therefore they have to sing, but rather there's a crisis of doubt, and to restore equilibrium, the characters kind of desperately reach for the flotsam and jetsam of excuses, of melodies, of ditties, of anthems, and try to kind of cobble them together to create this sort of song of false hope, song of desperate, deluded survival that gets them out of bed in the morning and allows them to look themselves in the mirror. And in that sense, where the truth lies in the end, and where the truth lies in, I think, also the act of killing, are in the cracks, whether it's in the dramatizations for Anwar or in the cracks in the songs, when it could be a rest between a chorus and a verse, or it could be the wall of silence, the wall of truth that they hit that stops them in their tracks as they're singing. So it's sort of through silence that the truth screams through in this movie. And that was my way, I think, of, now to come directly to your question, that was my way of sort of, I hope, making visible for at least some of you how I feel when I watch Golden Age musicals, which is utterly transported by the music, often deeply moved by the music, but at the same time horrified even to the point of tears by the lie inherent in it. The idea that everything, no matter how desperate the conditions, will somehow turn out for the best. That feels to me not like hope. The idea that our future is bright, that they sing at the end of this movie, or the sun will come out tomorrow, like they sing in Annie, which is not a Golden Age musical, but kind of a pastiche. That's not really hope. That's actually the wolf of despair in the sheep's clothing of hope. And real hope is never about just passively, optimistically insisting that tomorrow will be fine. But for me, real hope is what this movie's all about and what the girl offers, which is to stop, look honestly at our problems, look honestly at our reality, and believe that if we marshal all of our energy, creativity, love, solidarity, reach out to the widest possible human community, and determined to solve our existential problems, and within a family, our emotional problems, with honesty, with acceptance, with forgiveness, then actually it's not too late to solve our problems. And when you leave the cinema tonight, there'll still be a sky above you, and there'll still be breathable air. And whether we're in the 11th hour, in the 59th minute of the 11th hour, this movie, from the hundreds of people who made it, is an offering of, I think, real hope and real possibility. And it's a cautionary tale for the despair that drove the family into the bunker, and that has them just insisting that their future is bright when they can't look at the darkness that they've created for themselves.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's so much, going on in my mind, but your work really does seem to tread that line between fact or truth and fiction. The fact that you work in the medium of motion pictures requires us to give a little bit of ourselves, to transport ourselves to a fictional world, or a world that we're not part of, in order to relate to it personally, but also at a distance. So I'm wondering how you interact with or read films, and how that affects your filmmaking process.
How I interact with the films I make?
No, when you watch a film.
Oh.
Is there empathy in there? You say you become transported, but it's also you're keeping yourself at a distance from their despair.
Oh, that's an interesting question, I guess, if I understand you correctly. I definitely I think how I watch films, I'm very sensitive to sentimentality. And I don't mean sensitive in that I'm moved by sentimentality. It's that I'm very generally allergic to sentimentality. And I'm also kind of, maybe this seems paradoxical, but I'm also very sincere. I hope not entirely without humor, but sincere. And I think, it's easier maybe for me to think about less how I feel when I watch films, but that's a very apt question in a film museum, but how I feel about the people I film and put in my films, whether it's a fictional character that I collaborate with Tilda Swinton and my co-writers and my composer to create, or Anwar Congo, or in The Look of Silence, Adi Rukun, or any of the other people I've ever filmed. I think I look at people with a refusal ever to embrace the Star Wars morality, which I find repulsive in film and in life, where you divide the world into good people and bad people. I have a kind of allergy when people talk about Anwar Congo in The Act of Killing as a monster. He's a human being who's done monstrous things. He may be a psychotic human being. I don't think so. Hitler, I never met him, was also a human being who did monstrous things. He may have been a psychotic human being. I don't know. I have not met him. But the idea that when I'm trying to understand a human, I'm going to discard them as a monster feels terribly dangerous. I think you can divide the world into good guys and bad guys, and both sides of the political spectrum do it, but in negative image of the other. And I just feel like when I look at anyone to make a film about them, I just want to, through my camera, embrace them so tightly that I can feel what it's like to be them. Not just understand rationally, but I actually feel what it's like to be them. The other night I had dinner with someone who told me he was an empath, someone who feels other people's pain fully. And I listened and I understood that that's a curse, but because he was telling me it's a curse, because it's very painful to sit in a room with someone who's in pain. But I heard it. To me, it was like a metaphor, at least, for everything I aspire to. And I feel, yeah, so I feel that when I see a film that I think is presenting people dishonestly or simplistically, not to say I'm human, I can enjoy it. I'm subject to the tropes of movies and the tricks and that make people laugh and cry. But I often, through that kind of false vision of who we are that narrative often imposes on us, where we devote, this is what I call the Star Wars morality, I often find myself kind of either laughing in a horrified way, trying to get away from the movie, or even crying at the awfulness of the, crying over the awful consequences of the lie inherent in that mode of storytelling, if that makes sense. That's a little abstract, but it means that I can watch a musical number that's supposed to just make you chuckle or cry, and I can also feel my stomach turning. And I think of that. You know, Kundera talks about 2 tears. He says you cry first, since some of you have seen the act of killing. How many of you have seen the act of killing? Oh, quite a lot of you. Okay. So Kundera talks about how you can see something sad and it makes you cry a tear, but then you cry a second tear in rapid succession because you know the whole rest of the world is crying that first tear with you. And he says that's the beginning of kitsch, or I would say sentimentality. And that second tear is always escapist. It's always a way of turning away from whatever ethical obligation we might have to the thing that we're crying for, and escaping into the idea, the abstraction of the fellowship of man, or the reassurance that that humanity is generally good and crying with you. And I try in my work to bring people to a point where they're able to cry that third tear that I've always felt, where you're able, whether it's in the waterfall scene at the end of the act of killing, or whether it's in the final moments where girl is walking through the house, desperately trying to convince herself that their future is bright, that you're able to mourn the tragic consequences of escapism itself.
Obviously, you've worked with musical in the past, but there must have been some inspiration, and I think I read that Umbrellas of Cherbourg was one of those that you related to.
You know, Umbrellas of Cherbourg is really is probably my favorite movie musical, and that beautiful theme, da 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 da, that beautiful melody at the heart of that movie was something that Joshua Schmidt, the composer, and I really tried to find something that beautiful, and I think there's a few numbers where he equaled that in this, but I think one of them is the one that he kind of gravitated to, was that final melody you heard. Once the world was full of strangers, we kept our distance, so many dangers, we trusted no one. So that was like a key reference. Michel Legrand's score for the Demi film was like a key reference in our writing process. And Josh Schmidt saw that movie far more times than I've ever seen it. Like, you must have watched it hundreds of times to understand not so much the melodies, but the orchestrational ideas and the harmonic structures. But I think, you know, what you read about that was that I wanted to make a third film after The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence in Indonesia with the oligarchs who came to power through the genocide there. But after The Act of Killing came out, I wasn't allowed to return to Indonesia. I still am not allowed to return, even though it's over a decade ago. And so I started investigating oligarchs elsewhere in the world, and there was specifically an oil tycoon from Central Asia who had commissioned mass violence to obtain his oil concessions. And he was buying his family a bunker, much like the one in the end. And he invited me to take a look at it. It was a kind of unfinished former Soviet missile command center that had been abandoned and was now for sale. And it was to have many of the same features: the art vault, the underground pool, gardens, aquaponics for seafood and vegetables, a luxury car garage. And as we were touring this place, I was dying to ask, how would you cope with your guilt for the catastrophe from which you'd be fleeing? How would you cope with your remorse for for leaving loved ones behind? How would you raise a future generation here, which they imagine might be necessary, as a kind of blank canvas on which to paint an idealized portrait of yourself, for your own comfort? That is to say, how would you lie to your progeny about who you were and what you did and why? And I couldn't ask these questions. I didn't know them well enough. And they would not have been able to answer these questions if I'd asked. They were kind of living in denial of this whole family of self-questioning. So, but on the way home, I was thinking the only movie I really can imagine now making with this family is the Fly on the Wall documentary set in this bunker with the family 25 years after they move in. And I wasn't going to make that film. So not knowing what else to do, I thought I'd clear my head by watching Umbrellas of Cherbourg on my laptop. And that's when the idea for the end came to me. I finished the film and I thought, I know what I'll do. And now you've seen it.
Since you brought up Joshua Schmidt, and I'd like to talk about the music a little bit and about how that process came about, how you worked with him for the music. There's one thing that I noticed this time watching it was that the boy, especially near the beginning of the film, as he was climbing the scale, he would not quite reach that next logical note. It would be just a little bit minor or flat before he got to the top.
Yeah. Well, I think we were always looking for the cracks that would... I'm not talking about imperfections, because the characters are never out of tune. What they are is always singing live, and they're always singing in what I think is the most beautiful and vulnerable thing, the honest voice of the character in crisis. And unlike, I'm not always a fan of live singing in musicals. I sometimes think you feel like you're watching a filmed concert, as actors have to act and play the instrument of their voice at the same time. But I think Marius de Vries and Fiora Cutler, our vocal coach, just created this incredible space over a month of rehearsal and in the months leading up to the shoot, where they were able to get so proficient at controlling their voices, though they're not the buffed, over-polished, over-produced Broadway voices that we're accustomed to hearing in musicals or in Wicked, for example. Instead, that while they're truthful and honest to the moment, they're able to activate them through their inner life. And I think Josh wanted to write that into the music too. Little minor notes, little moments where a phrase stops when you don't expect it to, which lends energy to what comes next. Because that's also, it's just, the music becomes as important as the script and the lyrics for providing, in a way, the structure for these artists' inner lives as they sing, if that makes sense. Yeah. The process of writing with him, once we realized the songs were coming out of these crises of doubt, and in their most intense form would be these kind of breakdowns on film, everything else kind of followed, that we would shoot the songs in these long takes because we'd be bearing witness. Indeed, in the ensemble numbers, that meant that, if you're singing, Jared, and then you have to somehow pass, and I'm singing in duet, something you're doing has to bring the camera to me. It felt like a cheat to have some like off-screen sound or some preconceived camera movement whose momentum brings the camera to me without. So it had to be organic. The structure of the ensemble songs therefore determined the layout of the house, because we designed the rooms to make these single takes work. So there's a kind of musical, I love to think of this as a musical logic or song structure logic to the architecture of the home that's invisible to anyone who doesn't know how the home was designed. It also meant that the songs tend to often move from the house into the mine as these desperate attempts to cobble together a life raft increasingly fail, and they're sort of propelled by that journey from lie to truth, from the home, the the well-appointed home into the cold emptiness and deathly world of the salt mine. We shot in a salt mine for 3 weeks. That wasn't in Sicily. That wasn't a set. And then the other thing it meant was that I had to write the lyrics, which is what I was building to, because Joshua Schmidt said that, you're the only person, these are such intimate moments for the characters, they're their most intimate turning points in a way. The mother singing in the bathroom, that's as intimate as she'll be. So I was charged with writing the lyrics because no one else would know. I assumed we'd have a lyricist, and I was terrified by that. Much more afraid than I was generally making the act of killing, which says something weird about our culture and fear of failure in our culture. But I was terrified that, especially when he said I had to rhyme sometimes. And I remember hiking with my husband Shu in Norway, and he was like, okay, you're just gonna say everything you say to me today will rhyme. And that was my way of breaking the ice, and then I was able to do it. And but it was a magical experience, Jared, because I would write a bit of lyric and send it to Josh. This was during the pandemic, and he would just within hours or days come back with this extraordinary music, and sometimes it was just the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, and sometimes it was totally wrong, and I never figured out what in the lyric would generate what from his musical brain. So I felt like the sorcerer's apprentice. My words were the magic spells, but I had no idea what I was going to summon. But then Joshua was so generous. He would say, what line of melody feels right for the character here? Where does it feel wrong? And then he would invite me to change notes, and as I would invite him to refine the lyrics, and then we would shape the songs together.
Well, so you were talking about well, not in your documentaries, you didn't have necessarily elaborate camera movements, so that's something that was fairly new for you. But I did, again, watching it this time, notice some of your editing style in terms of relating that to the documentary. So a tableau with Michael Shannon behind the desk, where you're just sort of at a distance looking at him and then moving a bit toward him in the way that you do with your subjects in the documentaries.
Yeah, only I couldn't afford to move a bit toward them in the documentaries because I didn't have a dolly. But yeah. Yeah, no, I think there's a lot in the way silence is used, especially to punctuate the big dramatizations in the act of killing, these silent tableaus, the landscapes. We were very much concerned with creating in the act of killing and in the look of silence a haunted landscape. For those of you who've seen, I just saw that the look of silence, I don't live in the US, so I don't know where it's available everywhere, but I know it's on Netflix, so it's something, I just saw that. So you can actually watch the look of silence. It's I think a more gentle companion piece to the act of killing. But it's a very, the sense of trying to create a haunted landscape that was crucial to us in making those two documentaries was the same here. We wanted to haunt the salt mine and use the salt mine as a kind of, a last remnant of a haunted world. The art was that too. The art became these windows onto a lost, into a lost nature. Those Bierstadt luminous landscape paintings are kind of windows onto a nature that's not only lost but never really existed, because it's a romantic, he would say, I think, divinely inspired apparition of nature, rather like the father would say of his memoir, or the son would feel about his diorama.
I was just going to make that point, much like their invented history never existed in actuality. Yeah. I'm sure you get a lot of questions about Michael Shannon and Tilda Swinton, probably even George Mackay, but Lenny James seems to pop up in a lot of my favorite stuff. Can you talk about how he became involved with the project?
Well, when you cast an ensemble like this, we started with the mother, and then the son, and then the father, because you cast the nuclear family first. Then you can move on to the young woman, girl, and then friend, mother's best friend, and then you cast the butler and the doctor last. And so I had a lot of time to look at different people's work because we had to assemble the whole cast first. And I just thought there's something heartbreaking in him. And in the end, it was down to two brilliant actors. He was one of them, and then the other was slightly more theatrical, not in the sense of big, but in the sense of more, maybe a little more like, more prone to flights of fancy, like the father. And I thought it was quite important that the doctor's a cynic. And that's why the doctor doesn't have any song. He's the only one who doesn't really sing. He sings along because it's sort of his job to do so in the opening song, and maybe he's singing in the background in the closing number, but off camera. And then Lenny's a brilliant writer. So once he understood that the young woman that I cast to play girl was black, he had so many interesting ideas to help. And that therefore, because of that, the film would be inherently, in part, as one layer, not the most important, but in one layer, a film about whiteness, about the idea that your son, no matter how terrible things are going, that your son, no matter how terrible things are, will be okay. That's like the whitest idea in the United States of America. And once that led to so many interesting ideas, like something Lenny came up with when he has to handcuff girl. He said, what if he just asks her, why are you looking at me? Don't look at me like that. And of course, Lenny comes from a different background. He has a British accent. He's often asked to play an American, but here I wanted him to be British. And it was just, so he was just full of brilliant ideas, and he was such a wonderful collaborator too. You could just start to give him a note and say, I got it. He would just understand at once and do it beautifully. And then the thing about him is he's so heartbreaking at the end of the film. I mean, he's managed in just a few scenes to give this side character a full arc. And I think it was just a joy because that came out of the collaboration with him. This film would have probably been all right without Doctor having that kind of arc, and it was something we found at the very end of the writing and with him, and then in rehearsal. There was a month of rehearsal, and we for the cast to internalize its secrets and its ways of maintaining equilibrium. One of the interesting things we did about that was to ask people after a scene which ends in conflict or impasse to just ask, so what happens next? And it was amazing how they would immediately find harmony again, like water finding down.
I could probably go on for hours just asking you about this stuff, but Joshua has agreed to take some questions from the audience. We are recording this, so we have a microphone in the back. If you want to ask a question, please just raise your hand and we'll come around to you.
Don't be shy.
We've covered everything up here on stage.
No, we haven't, and I saw a question.
I don't have a question. I just want to say that I love what you did with color in every scene. It had to be intentional. It was
yeah,
fabulous.
Thank you so much. The mine was cooler because it serves as the exteriors. Like if there's three things that make the bunker less claustrophobic, it was very important that the bunker be not like the bunker in the film Downfall, for example, where you're constantly feeling like you're in a bunker, because as the characters convince themselves through song that they're living the best possible life they could have, and because we're reprising melodies when they do that, the idea is that you kind of are humming along unconsciously. You know that and you're enjoying the melody unconsciously. So you've slipped into their skin, into their shoes, and your musical self is identifying, feeling what it's like to lie to yourself, because that's what the songs are doing. And that meant that we should be able to forget that we're in a bunker from time to time and just sort of think we're in a sumptuous living room. And the paintings were one way of doing that, but having exteriors in the mine, which were slightly cooler in light than the interiors, which is how that normally works in film, was a kind of key way of doing that. And then the final thing we did was having a kind of simulated daylight diffusing through the rooms through these skylights, which was an architectural feature that you have both in Versailles and in the White House. And that allowed us to change the color of the light, especially in the songs, as the songs go on.
Yeah, as they move from room to room, the color changes, the temperature changes, so that you get a different contrast as they're coming towards you. The color of the room is changing behind them as they move into the next one.
Yeah, it's changing. Well, sometimes it's fading out as they move in the son and girl's duet before they cut to the mine. Sometimes it's fading, or in the mother's bathroom. Sometimes it's changing from cool to warm as if clouds are passing overhead very quickly. Sometimes it's rising in the opening song from just a very gray dawn up to a golden sunlight, in which they yet manage to look pale and washed out.
New questions? We got more hands. Oh, one over here. Leslie, thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Do I have to do anything? Okay. Okay, there was a lot of intellectual play between the characters, high-level, intensive intellectual analysis. And I thought it was kind of strange, well, I shouldn't say strange, but caught me off guard, that there was a homophobic slur, which is really like gutter-type talk against the butler. First of all, and the other question is, why was it important to let us know that he was gay? And my second question, after I won't get the mic back, is what was the purpose the black woman couldn't swim?
Well, a couple of things. So I think she can swim. She swam across the river, as she tells in the story. She says that she swam across the river. So the intention was that she can swim, but she's traumatized. And at the end, she's, again, swimming fine. I can understand, but she's a strong swimmer and swam across this raging river and then felt she killed her family by doing so because they drowned. And then I wouldn't say that the dialogue to answer your question about the father calling the butler a faggot, I wouldn't say, and I have no problem, I repeat that deliberately. I've been called a faggot so many times. It's like I'm not going to tiptoe around the shit we call each other. But I wouldn't say that it's a high level of intellectual dialogue, but I feel what they are is very conflict averse. And they're kind of constantly, everything is happening in subtext, and it's what they're not saying, and they're tiptoeing around each other because they can't name the truths of their situation. And for me, when the father turns on his friend, he loses control. He shows an ugly side of him that in this microcosm of the bunker offers a glimpse to maybe the way to sort of a rage and an aggression that he must have had as a human being managing his oil empire. And I feel that the father, Michael Shannon's performance to me is like as avuncular and sweet as Jimmy Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, yet with this underbelly of self-hatred which morphs into rage, which morphs back into self-hatred. And I don't think there are some people who see the film and see that sort of song that Butler and father sing as a sign of there being some gay subtext between them. That's fine. I have no problem with that. It's not how I imagined it. I just imagine that it's fine. That's a totally legitimate interpretation that I understood people could have. But I just thought that this is someone who father has used his whole life and has been nice to and cared for and taken under his wing and also enabled, and this comes to your question about why he's gay, not to ever have to live his own life. You know, I remember Michael and Tim talked about, you know, maybe they grew up, maybe Michael thought a little bit about Donald Trump going to, you know, slumming it in some of the places where his father had real estate, and Tim being the gay kid who was bullied, Butler being the gay kid who was bullied, and father kind of taking him under his wing and protecting him, but also in a way, maybe sometimes not being above sniggering at him behind his back. And I think but what's beautiful to me about the Butler is that he's in a way, apart from Son, the first person to learn the lesson the gift, and to accept the gift that girl brings into this bunker, which is the ability to feel regret or even guilt, in girl's case, without shame. And the difference, of course, between guilt and shame, because we use them often interchangeably, is that guilt is compunction. It's an awful feeling of pain. And shame is another awful feeling of pain, but concerned with how you look in the eyes of others. And this is a family trapped in a prison of shame, and someone comes in and says, I feel this awful guilt. I come from a family where we could be honest about our mistakes. I need to be accepted for who I am and seen in my guilt, and they can't do that because they mirror their own guilt. And I think it's this wonderful surprise that this side character who we've hardly heard from is the very first person to step forward and kind of really disclose that he had a life, that he regrets never having lived his own life and followed his own path and been his own person. So that's maybe the answer to those questions. Yeah, no, thank you for the questions.
Oh, there's a couple of hands over here now. Leslie's coming around. So are you already working towards your next film?
I'm dreaming it up. Yeah, I'm literally dreaming it up in my dreams.
Love the film. There was so much like humor that came from how much empathy you had for the characters. So many funny moments. I was wondering, it feels like violence is like always on the verge of like breaking out. There's so much like intensity and tension, and at the end of the film, it doesn't. It almost feels like there's a sort of equilibrium that's restored. There's like a certain amount of like false hope that it sort of like rings out on. Like, how did you get to the place in the writing process where you decided that it wasn't going to end badly in the story, that we were going to have to fill that in for ourselves?
Yeah, I love that question because I think it felt to me like, you know, the story could end in many ways. It could end with redemption for the family. They're almost able to to open up and love each other properly as a family. They almost reach that point. And before New Year's, when Moses Ingram's character tells her opens up about her home, her longing for her family, and then her feelings of guilt. But I felt that this is a story about the last human family. While I was writing, I thought this is the story about the last human family, or one of the last human families. If we give them redemption and give them a happy ending, or retribution or kind of revolution where righteous violence breaks out, and sort of the tension is released. It just felt like a lie, and an immoral lie. Because and as I've thought about the film more as I made it, I came to realize that this film seems to be set in the future, but it's really our present in microcosm. This family is the entire human family. The nameless characters are me and you and each and every one of you. The film is polarizing because some people don't want to hear these things about themselves and will say that's not me in any way, and that's okay. And it's also every single one of our families. And it just felt to me like the whole point of this project is that the dynamics, the dysfunctions, the inability to be honest with each other, the inability to accept responsibility and ask forgiveness when we've wronged each other, and makes it impossible for us to protect what we love, makes it impossible for us to really love, because our relationships become hollowed out as I can't talk about how I think you've hurt me and you can't talk about how I might have hurt you, and then we end up in this the kind of thing you've just seen on screen. And I think both in our private families or our most intimate families, which end in their private ends of loss and death, which we all face in life, and as a human family, where we can't acknowledge, or we acknowledge, but we can't come together collectively as a family and take action upon the way we're harming each other and the planet. We're on a path toward destruction. Those dynamics are the path to destruction. They are what will bring us to the end. They are the road over the precipice. And at the end of that road, the last people will quietly go. And this is, in that sense, as I said earlier, a cautionary tale. And like every cautionary tale that's ever been made, it's made as an act of hope. The hope, namely, that there's still time for people to heed the warning. So it felt like we should see our world now in microcosm. And actually, now in microcosm, after the same dynamics you see now in microcosm have caused and brought our world to this end. And actually, that was a similar thing, a similar concern in the act of killing, where it's, although decades have passed since the genocide, there's really a continuity with the genocide, or with the immediate aftermath of genocide, that's emphasized. It's as if this is 2 years after the genocide, not 50 years after the genocide, because there's been no change. There's been no acknowledgement. There's been no acceptance of the dysfunctional and unjust, immoral, grotesque patterns of behavior and power structures. Because I think climate change is not just about, why should I recycle more if you're not going to recycle more? Why should China cut its emissions if America's not going to cut its emissions? Climate change is, I think, really fundamentally about an imbalance of power, where you have these enormously powerful corporations not paying for the damage they're doing. And if the damage from fossil fuels were priced into what we pay at the gas station, we wouldn't be using fossil fuels anymore. We'd be pointing pieces of glass at the sun for all of our electricity. And we'd have better batteries by now, and enormous numbers of them. So it's just to say that I think it's just to say that we somehow must and can come together, and in this perilous and frightening moment in our history, rediscover something we've done before, which is to come together and really collectively find our power to resist, and not go off and be isolated in our homes and on social media, but really come together and resist, and up to and including nonviolent civil disobedience, and rediscover a deeper quality of being human. I say rediscover because we've done it before, and there's time yet for us to do it again.
I was going to say, get some applause after that one. A couple more questions. We got Debbie right here, and there's the one back
Hi.
there. Leslie?
Hello. First of all, I just want to say I don't think I've seen a film like this before.
It's just a very unusual film, and I particularly appreciate the way all the characters are blunted because of their failure to recognize the truth, and the way, especially the boy, just the way his ability to communicate, express, is twisted, is torn from meaning in a way because he's been so separated from the truth, and he's been asked to recreate the truth of his father, which is insane. The question I had was, what is the significance of that thing that keeps on going through the...
Oh, that's an easy one. That's the air supply, and that was actually our air supply in the bunker. I mean, in the mine. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But I'll just say one lovely story about Tilda, since that's such a short answer compared to all my others, where Tilda has this amazing look on her face when she's startled by it. That's what the script called for, and it's sort of like peace comes over her, which was the opposite. It was perfect, and it was the opposite of what the script said, and what we talked about. And I said, "What were you working with, Tilda?" And she said, "It was the earth breathing, the dead earth come to life and breathing, and it was so comforting." And I think that's just a beautiful example also of where my work as a documentary filmmaker and my work as now a narrative filmmaker are the same, because in both forms, I'm trying to make films out of anomalies, by which I mean the things that I instantly recognize as true and truer than I could have envisioned, because they're not what I expected. So it's that, that's it, and it's not what I expected. And that was just a beautiful example of one of those moments.
Yes, there's pointed to
do you have any? You mentioned Kundera, and so it got me thinking of the absurdism in Gombrowicz, if that's how you say it. Do you have any literary influences that just broadly appeal, like in your writing process, or kind of like were like a deep inspiration for this film?
Well, I mean, apart from the poetry of T.S. Eliot, which I only started looking at again while I was editing, there's one piece in particular, which is Samuel Beckett's Happy Days. Yeah.
All right. Well, Joshua, what? We got, okay.
I was thinking about in this film how the girl has to share a space with the father who's pretty much directly responsible for the devastation. And it reminded me of the screening last night of The Act of Killing, where you and more directly people from Indonesia had to spend time with Anwar and everybody who was directly responsible for the horrible killings. And I want to know the process for understanding the girl character in this movie, and also for you personally, what it was like to spend time with somebody who was contradictorily so horrible and terrifying, but also weirdly like friendly and fun, and that bizarre contradiction, and whether or not like the quest for empathy almost like forced you to like, did you ever find yourself liking him as a person, or enjoying your time with him and Herman and all these like weird horrible people, or were you constantly like in a mode of like suffering, or reminding yourself how horrible what they did was?
First of all, I think it's a really astute observation, because in both the end and in the end, her character is the antagonist, dramatically speaking. And in The Act of Killing, I'm the antagonist. And in both cases, I bring with me the past and honesty, and the young woman in the end brings with her the past and holds up a mirror to everyone. And I came to like, I could at moments enjoy Anwar's playfulness and his wit, usually because I was filming it and I knew that it would be delicious and delightful at times in doses. And maybe it also made certain things that otherwise would just be bleak and uncomfortable bearable. We regularly had to take breaks. We had a pact, me and my closest Indonesian crew, that whenever we felt this is just too awful to bear, or that he's a monster, because there were stories. One of the things in the editing of the film was that we found we were excluding 99% of the awful things that they told us about or showed us or testified to. And when I had that feeling, we would insist on taking a break. We'd go up to the mountains nearby and just take a couple nights off, or sometimes a week away. And there's a moment in the film where he starts blaming, in the kind of fever dream of a final hour that film has, where he starts blaming his victims, and he starts, it's this awful scene that starts as a kind of improvised role player game with Herman, and he's dressed as a man, but he starts playing his woman character, and he starts with the teddy bear, and Anwar cuts up the teddy bear and says, "You're the real barbarian here." And the idea that he could blame his victim and feel self-pity because you've made me do this, that obviously comes from his own sense that what he's doing is wrong and is causing him to suffer and is haunting him, and the idea that now he's going to acknowledge that, but then through that very human acknowledgement, because that comes from guilt, from the very guilt that we would say makes him a human being and normally prevents us from crossing a line and hurting each other even worse, that actually becomes the fodder for, or the fuel for his sadism. That terrified me. And that night when we filmed that scene, I went home and I had a nightmare. And the next day I woke up I woke up from the nightmare and couldn't sleep anymore because I was too afraid that I would have it again. I knew I would have it again. And then the next night, I couldn't sleep at all because I think I did have it again. And then I then started this pattern where I would have that nightmare, not sleep the next night, the rest of the night, not sleep the next night, and then collapse. And it just went on for, I think, about a year and a half. And it was grim. And I got through it through the love of Shu, who's sitting right there, and also especially my incredible family of an Indonesian crew that made the film with me, and we all tried to support each other, and we were probably a little bit reckless with our each other's mental health, but I do feel love for Anwar Congo. I did feel love for him. He died in 2019. We stayed in touch all the way, regularly until he died. It's not friendship, but that journey, that 5-year journey we took together, defined a big part of my youth, I guess, and I know him so well. I held him so tightly that I felt what it was like to be him, that I understand. I'm not excusing. I'm just saying that I'm very lucky not to have grown up in his house and had to discover whether I would make the same choices that he made. And that, I don't know, that's what, that sense that what the end is ultimately about. I don't know if I'd say the act of killing is fundamentally about love, but I think the end at its most basic is a film about love.
Joshua, you've been extremely generous with your time. Thank you so much for coming and visiting with us. Joshua Oppenheimer, everyone.